So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, you two. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur, once again here to look for any valid reason to think that Adam and Eve might have been historical. As was the case in the previous two episodes, we're still looking at John Sanford's interview with Eric Hovind on the latter's show Creation Today. The first episode was just John telling us, in very clear words, that he doesn't really care about things like evidence, data, or reality. He just cares that his marriage was saved by going to church, and somehow that justifies him abandoning basically his entire career as a scientist. The second episode was various argumenta ad populum et ad auctoritate. Hooray for Latin. Now let's hope that in this final segment we get at least one single non-fallacious argument in favor of the historical evidence for Adam and Eve.
Actually, let's save it for later. Why do people reject what is obviously true? And what
Great question.
Their faith and their hope in heaven relies upon it, and yet they say that stuff doesn't matter.
Well, I guess there it is. It's also a fear of death, because apparently, according to Sanford, if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, you're going to hell. I've never actually heard of that being the official doctrine of any church, but maybe Sanford and Hovind are starting their own church of Adam and Christ, where the central figure is Adam.
Of course it matters. That's why God wrote it down for us.
The Bible was written by humans, and in the case of Genesis, it was written by several humans and then stitched together by yet another human.
So now we're going to jump into genetics. Okay.
Back when John was a scientist, that was his field, so hopefully we get at least a single valid argument out of him on this topic.
Point is, it's not just genetics, but genetics is, by God's grace, he's giving us evidence. Why? Because
he knows that a book isn't really enough reason on its own to believe something, especially when it wasn't even close to being written contemporaneously to the topics it covers, as in Genesis.
The times are so evil, and because there's so many bad things happening, he's saying, look, this is kind of hard for you guys, you Christians. I'm going to give you a pass, and even though you should believe me by faith.
Well, you heard it here, folks. For Sanford, faith means believing things for no rational reason.
I'm going to give you a bunch of evidence that will fortify your faith.
Okay, let's see what evidence the Almighty deems good enough to convince everyone that Adam and Eve existed. 7
genetic evidences supporting a literal Adam and Eve. I hope you're all waiting. This is going to take 2 or 3 hours. I hope you don't mind.
Honestly, at this point, if it was hours of arguments whose conclusions actually followed from their premises, then I wouldn't mind. It would actually be something to respond to beyond just pointing out that Sanford's points don't actually give us a reason to believe Adam was real, even if his premises are correct. Which, to be fair, some of them were.
We're going to talk about mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Adam, population bottlenecks, designed variants within the genome, the Babel dispersion, ape to man refuted, and genetic entropy.
We only have like 13 minutes left with Sanford here. So he's going to talk about all of these in less than 2 minutes each on average. It's almost like maybe these should have been the whole point, rather than confessions that he didn't have any good reason to reject science, and that unsurprisingly, Adam and Eve are in the Bible.
Okay, so hang on, here we go. Evidence number 1, mitochondrial Eve. Google mitochondrial Eve, you'll find out that the whole world, including the scientific world, thinks that all of the human beings on this planet come from one woman.
Well, kind of. In fact, even if Eve existed, there's a good chance she wouldn't actually be mitochondrial Eve. Rather, one of her descendants would be. You see, mitochondrial Eve is the most recent common mitochondrial ancestor of extant humans. So it's not so much a person as it is a title which can and has and will change in terms of who holds it. Someone alive today may become a future mitochondrial Eve. Think about this in terms of your own family. You got your mitochondria from whomever provided the ovum that was fertilized by a sperm to become the zygote that grew into you. That ovum contained mitochondria, and they became your mitochondria. Now, I don't want to assume your family history or anything about gender, but for the sake of ease, I'm going to call the person who gives their mitochondria a mother. Your mother got her mitochondria from her mother, your grandmother. She got it from her mother, your great-grandmother, and so on. But let's look forward. Let's say that your mother has 3 children. 1 girl who can pass on mitochondria and 2 boys who cannot. Well now, we know that the boys aren't going to pass on her mitochondria, but let's say that just by chance, the girl herself has 3 kids. but all of them are boys. Your mom's mitochondrial line has now died out. But note that her genetic legacy has not. In fact, if we assume that all her children, including you, have, say, 3 children, she now has 9 grandchildren, all of whom have her DNA, just not her mitochondrial DNA. But if all we look at is mitochondria, your mom is invisible to us. Instead, other mothers contributed their mitochondrial DNA to your mom's lineage. So it's pretty obvious how a mitochondrial lineage can die out. If a mother's descendants fail to produce future mothers at any point, even if it produces fathers, then boom, the lineage is gone, even though the nuclear or autosomal DNA isn't. Now let's do the reverse. Let's say that your mother has all future mothers, except maybe for you, since I don't know you or your reproductive capacity or intentions. Now let's say that humans colonize Mars, and just by chance, all the people there who can produce ova and bear children are part of her mitochondrial lineage. Then something happens, and humans on Earth are wiped out. Well, guess what? Now your mother is the mitochondrial Eve of the human species. Now this does not have to happen because of some cataclysm. Over time, just by chance, some mitochondrial lineages will spread and others will shrink. And so at any given time, there is a mathematical certainty that there will be a coalescent ancestor genome for mitochondria among extant members of a species. But that does not make this ancestor the first mother, nor does it mean that there were not other mothers at the time, nor does it mean that those other individuals do not have living descendants. Now, if Eve existed, she could be mitochondrial Eve, but does not need to be. So in conclusion, the existence of a coalescent ancestor for mitochondrial DNA is not in the least evidence for a historical biblical Eve.
But they say, but it's not Eve. Yes, we do have evidence that there's a single woman who gave rise to all the mitochondria on the planet, but don't think it's Eve.
Yes, because there's no reason to think that it is. Once again, we have an argument that isn't even valid. Both the young Earth creationists and scientific models of human history involve a mitochondrial Eve. Now, conveniently, we can actually test how long ago this person would have lived, and it's on the order of hundreds of thousands of years ago, not thousands of years ago. So it still doesn't help out young Earth creationist versions of Eve, but it fits in fine with a genealogical Eve like Swamidass has proposed, and like we mentioned earlier in the series.
So they originally started calling her mitochondrial Eve.
Yep, they did, because it's an evocative title. Just like when we call a big old crater on Mars Hellas Planitia, even though it's nowhere near Greece. Or we call a bit of Venus Aphrodite Terra, despite the fact that very few, if any, astronomers believe in Aphrodite. Look, I think it's fairly well known that I am not now and have never been Muslim. However, for various reasons, I really like the story of Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem and from there to the heavens. As a result, I have several times named things in background material for art projects or TTRPG games after his means of conveyance, al-Buraq. Does that mean that I actually think Muhammad rode on the back of a winged horse with a human head to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and then went up to heaven? No, of course not. If he even told that story, I think he was lying. Even in the sources, it kinda sounds like he's making shit up as he goes along, but I don't care. I like the story, so I reference it. That's all the scientists did when they came up with the name Mitochondrial Eve.
And later they decided to just call her the first, or they used a term for it, I can't think of it, but...
Our expert in genetics, ladies and gentlemen, dinosaurs, and others, there are a number of accurate things you can call mitochondrial Eve, such as the most recent common mitochondrial ancestor, the mitochondrial coalescent point, etc. The difference is that rather than being a fun evocative title, they're just descriptive, which is also good, just for different reasons.
They tried to get rid of Eve.
I mean, I just did a Google Scholar search for mitochondrial Eve and restricted the results to from January 1st, 2024 until present, and I'm writing this on January 23rd, 2025. So basically the previous 13 months or so. 1,330 results came back. When I did the same but restricted the date range to January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2020, I got 1,260 results, which is basically the same. So I see no evidence to say that there is any suppression of the term mitochondrial Eve. It seems like it's been in steady use for at least the past 4 years. Heck, if I only check the year 2000, it comes up 373 times. So it looks like it might be gaining in popularity. I would be fascinated to see what evidence Sanford has that there is some conspiracy to erase the term mitochondrial Eve from the scientific vocabulary. Surely he must have some, and it's not just made up, right?
Now they don't use that term anymore because it's so clear that there's only one way, only one woman could give rise to all of humanity, and that would be by literal Eve.
Well, since I already covered this, let's just move on.
She is called by everybody the mother of us all.
That's because if you look at your mom, and her mom, and her mom, and so on, only with moms, we all get back to the same mom eventually. That does not make her the first mom, or the only mom contemporary to her. Because if you do something else, like perhaps look at your mom's dad, and then his mom, then his dad, some people will not converge on that same person. And there's also no reason to think that the person all humans converge to when only looking down an unbroken line of mothers did not herself have a mother.
And all our mitochondrial chromosomes.
Mitochondria each only have one chromosome, and it's circular, just like a bacterial genome. Because fundamentally, mitochondria are symbiotic bacteria that live inside eukaryotic cells.
Come from one woman.
Yup, as demanded by standard population genetics. And remember, she lived far too long ago to be the Eve Sanford believes in.
Is that like sort of interesting? Maybe?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's just that it provides evidence against Sanford's idea of a historical Eve.
I think so.
I mean, especially in light, when we contrast it with evolution, which says, no, it's populations that evolved over time. And so we wouldn't have come from one, ape ancestor that ended up evolving, which is what William Lane Craig is buying into now.
Mitochondrial Eve was a Homo sapiens. She wasn't any ancestral species, and the fact that other parts of the genome have even longer coalescent times on its own means that she wasn't the first member of that species. So Eric is just imagining that mitochondrial Eve is something we know she was not. In this case, I don't think he's doing it intentionally. Eric is not a very smart man, although he was smart enough to cut his abusive criminal father out of his life and the life of his children. And I think he is just accepting what Sanford is telling him credulously. But the result is that he is strawmanning mitochondrial Eve and coming to conclusions that simply are contrary to what the evidence is concerning her.
It seems like the evidence, you're right, goes right to one woman versus a population of women.
For that to be the case, the coalescent times for mitochondrial Eve would have to at least match the time to the most recent 4 alleles for the rest of the genome, or be longer than it, with no part of the autosomal genome having longer time to the most recent 4 alleles than the coalescent time for the mitochondrial genome. That is not the case, so no, the evidence does not show that.
Right. So basically, the people who reject this data are basically have just, stuck their head in the ground.
I mean, that's true. It's just that those people are young Earth creationists. They are the ones who reject the measured coalescence times, not just for mitochondrial DNA, but also for the Y chromosome, and for basically all parts of the rest of the genome.
And they just don't want to hear it.
Projection! Projection! Okay, first, scientists don't think about you, John. They're not trying to undermine anything. They're just trying to learn about the world through the tools of science. Second, many Christians manage to get along just fine while accepting the scientific conclusions about human origins. So even if this were designed to undermine God, His Word, or His people, it's doing a really bad job of it.
It has to do with deliberately trying to undermine God and God's people.
Okay, the only thing I can think of that could mean that isn't completely bonkers is that Sanford thinks that the book of Genesis was faithfully transmitted to us. And while there are problems with that, such as that we know that the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts, our 2 oldest witnesses to Genesis, differ, and the former has older manuscripts, meaning that there is good reason to suppose that one or both have been altered somewhat from an earlier manuscript tradition now lost to us. And I tend to think it's both, but the Septuagint probably more. I will say that I do think that the level of textual preservation in Genesis from ancient times is pretty good. However, I think that's probably giving Sanford too much credit, and I think he's about to say something far, far more dumb than just that our current manuscripts of Genesis are reliable.
And so this is very serious business, but what's interesting is God got it to us in spite of everybody, the evolutionists' desire to suppress this.
I mean, I was right, and yeah, it makes sense that now that we're in the genetics section, we're getting a genetics argument. This paper is indeed by Rob Carter, and it was published in a real science journal. It curiously steers clear of ever mentioning Eve, the age of the Earth, any way to calculate how long ago the ancestral genome existed, out of Babel, the flood, or anything like that. It also just concludes that a consensus mitochondrial genome can be reconstructed for humans, which isn't exactly surprising, although it is interesting. I'm not sure how Sanford is going to pretend this helps his case.
Okay, evidence. We're going to talk a little bit about Eve's mitochondrial DNA consensus sequence. That's a mouthful.
Yep, then you try to figure out if you can reconstruct the original. and the original is the consensus text. Got it.
A consensus sequence means that, let's suppose you have 1,000 people. Let's suppose then you've given them all the same book, and then you come in and you change letters.
He then goes on to say that he actually helped with this paper and should be a co-author, but that it wouldn't have been published with both of their names on it. I find that unlikely, but whatever.
We just call it mitochondrial diversity within modern human populations. So we didn't want to say Eve because we knew that in the mainstream journals, they would not tolerate a paper like that.
Weird how real scientists won't just drag their journals through the mud by letting cranks publish things that make unwarranted conclusions that are precluded by the data that are actually found in the world. It's probably a conspiracy to make reality look right and make made-up stuff look not right.
But it's just stunning.
I don't know how it's stunning or how it's supposed to be evidence for Eve. At least not any more than the bare existence of mitochondrial Eve is supposed to be evidence for it.
This is one way of... So Rob looked at all, I think 800 women from all over the world.
All over the world, except that the paper itself points out that it is missing data in geographically significant ways, and even points out that Africa, the place with the most human genetic diversity, is particularly poorly sampled.
To kind of find out where the consensus would be. And then we were able to find the red dot there is the mitochondrial consensus sequence.
Wow.
Now, because there have been thousands of years between now and Eve,
hundreds of thousands,
you'll see that all of the blue dots are the different women.
Those dots represent genomes, not women. And in fact, you can sample mitochondrial DNA from men. They still have it, and it still falls into the exact same group as that from women. It's just that cis men don't pass on mitochondrial DNA, so their children won't correlate with their mitochondrial DNA.
And some of them have spread further, but they're all diverging away from the original. So,
yep, that sure is how mutation accumulation works. I'm not really sure what the argument is supposed to be. Like, does Sanford think that evolutionary biologists think that over time diverse genomes should come together to form a single unvarying genome? Because I guess they mutate to be more alike? Because that's not something any biologist I've ever heard of thinks. And it's really not how math works. If you can figure out how this is supposed to help him, please let me know.
Red is the past of Eve, the ancient sequence.
It's the consensus genome, which is hypothesized as the ancestral genome. So yes, it's in the past, but there isn't a past axis or anything like that on this graph, so calling it the past is a bit weird. Also, based on what Sanford is telling us, it seems like all the blue dots represent extant genomes, meaning that there really is no way in which time is represented on this chart.
And the blue is the modern day people coming from her.
Okay, I was right. Time is not represented here.
And what we see is, it's very clear that we're seeing, we can go in and we know the sequence. We know her sequence for her mitochondria.
Well, first, no, the consensus genome does not necessarily represent the actual ancestral genome. It probably does in basically any one place, but it's possible that after a split from the common ancestor, two lines could happen to both have the same mutation somewhere, and this mutation would be recovered as the consensus. So the consensus is probably very close to the genome of the most recent mitochondrial ancestor, but there's no way to say it's completely identical.
We know her genetic DNA.
But what about her non-genetic DNA? Jokes aside, I still fail to see how this is supposed to be evidence of Eve. No one disagrees that there was at some point a most recent common ancestor for human mitochondrial DNA. That's essentially a mathematical inevitability. And at most, all this seems to do is provide evidence for something we already know, but not for any of Sanford's views in particular.
That's
the
amazing.
woman that most people say never existed, but who clearly is the first woman to give rise to humanity.
First, no one that I'm aware of says that mitochondrial Eve never existed. Her existence is basically a mathematical certainty, but it's also not evidence of a historical Eve, who, even if she existed, might not actually be mitochondrial Eve anyway. So basically, all Sanford and Carter did, from what I can tell, is just give us a consensus genome that is probably close to the mitochondrial genome of mitochondrial Eve, which isn't at all evidence for historical Eve from the Bible. I don't see how the logical through line is supposed to go. It's like pointing out that the Bible portrays Jesus as a man and then pointing to the fact that men exist as compelling evidence for the historical reliability of the canonical Gospels.
So amazing.
It's not.
Here we have the rings. The rings mean 50 mutations. So you'll see within that ring, most of these less than 50 mutations have accumulated within the first ring. And then there are people further out who have more mutations.
Yep, not sure how that's supposed to help, but okay.
We're all mutating, and we all different parts of our chromosomes are mutating. But what we see is this dispersion coming out of the original Eve.
But that's what you're going to see when focusing on any part of the genome and tracing it back to its coalescent point. That's what mutations do. They increase genetic diversity. And all parts of the genome have a coalescent point representing the most recent common ancestor for that part of the genome. Like, this is true regardless of the historical existence of Adam or Eve. And further, we can measure how long it has been since the actual existence of this common ancestor. And guess what? It's a couple of orders of magnitude too much for Sanford's idea in terms of the Y chromosome and mitochondria, and even worse in terms of the rest of the human genome. So this does not help at all. There is far too much diversity, and the bare existence of diversity coming from an ancestral genome is non-dispositive.
I'm in Florida, which is just south of Alabama, and I see some of those dots way out there with a whole lot of mutations, Dr. Sanford. I think I've met some of them up in Alabama.
And here's Eric being a bigoted asshole. I guess that's not surprising.
How long ago did Eve live?
That's a nonsensical question, since we haven't even begun to establish that she lived at all.
Well, we found that on average, the typical person who's come from Eve has 21 mutations different from Eve.
Okay, well, that's nice trivia, but it's meaningless to the question. See, if we assume that the coalescent point for mitochondrial DNA is in fact just Eve from the Bible, which again, we know it's not, then in order to date how long ago she lived, we have to use the maximum divergence, not the average divergence. Now, the graph had 3 rings, each representing 50 mutations that have accumulated, and his most distant data points were between the mark for 100 and 150, so let's just assume 125. Or more than 3 times more than what he's going with here. That means that even if we ignore the fact that he's using mutation rates instead of known substitution rates, which is malpractice on its own, since most mutations do not persist, we get a time to Eve of 31,250 years, well outside the range of any young Earth creationist timeline. But hey, let's see what he does.
Pretty small number, really, although that chromosome is quite small.
Which is completely irrelevant, but whatever.
So basically, we approximately the mutation rate for that chromosome, the mitochondrial chromosome, 0.1 per generation. So that's rough.
Which is inappropriate, since we know that as we measure across more and more generations, the rate of accumulation of novel mutations starts to go down. This is for very obvious reasons. Selection and drift act to reduce genetic diversity. Unless Sanford wants us to believe that there is literally no drift and no selection acting on the mitochondria of humans, then the mutation rate cannot be the actual accumulation rate across many generations. Indeed, creationists often use rates that are around an order of magnitude or more greater than the measured replacement rates in humans. And if we add an order of magnitude onto our back-of-the-envelope calculation based on Sanford's numbers to account for the difference between mutation and substitution rates, we recover an approximate time that mitochondrial Eve would have lived of about 300,000 years ago, and the consensus date is about 200,000 years ago, which goes to show why we both know that the young Earth timeline is wrong, and why Sanford's alleged evidence of Eve is nothing of the sort.
So that's roughly how many mutations per generation. So we're getting new mutations every generation.
Most of which will not persist in the long term, making this kind of grandmother to mother to daughter mutation rate higher than the actual rate at which mutations will accumulate across many generations. And by many, I don't mean thousands, I mean scores. And it's not like creationists don't understand that things like drift and selection reduce genetic diversity. They use it as a talking point about how you can't get anatomical or biochemical novelty from the mechanisms of evolution. They're wrong about that conclusion, but it's not like they're wrong that those things reduce genetic diversity. If you ignore mutations, you get the prediction that diversity declines. If you forget drift and selection, you get outsized rates of genetic diversity increase. You have to include both, or you're just ignoring hugely important parts of how population genetics works. Sanford is just ignoring selection and drift, and pretending that by this rather obvious lie, and also cherry-picking his starting point, he can show that mitochondrial Eve is Eve, and that the timelines match up. But hey, if you want to ignore reality, and lie and cheat on top of that to show that you're right, it probably just means that you're wrong. Now recently, at the time of this writing, one Dr. Robert Carter has tried to argue that selection and drift do not apply to the haploid portions of the human genome, i.e. the mitochondria and Y chromosomes, in terms of differentiating the pedigree mutation rate and the long-term substitution rate. Of course, that's silly and dumb, and just by chance, as a lineage accumulates mutations, it may go extinct, eliminating all of those mutations. Similarly, if some mutation in the Y chromosome lowers the fitness of males who carry it, they will be less likely to pass on their Y chromosome, and so when their lineage goes extinct, it will take all those mutations on the Y chromosome that have accumulated with it. Further, this isn't even a question we have to ask. We have measured the difference between Y chromosome mutation rates and substitution rates, and they're not even close to the same.
So we just combine 21 accumulated mutations with the rate of 0.1, and we get 210 generations since Eve.
Cool. Now let's try it with the actual important number of mutations, the maximum divergence, which is closer to 125, and then a more reasonable accumulation rate that does not pretend that selection and drift don't exist, which is more like 0.01. If we divide 125 by 0.01, we get 12,500 generations. This would give us a generation time of 16 years for humans if we assume the 200,000 years for mitochondrial Eve is right. That's a bit low, but also Sanford's estimate of 25 is probably a bit high for a historical estimate. So whatever, based on some very basic assumptions that crucially take into account the real world, we're currently at about 12,500 generations for mitochondrial Eve. It's probably a bit less, so let's be generous and cut it in half. So 6,250 generations.
And since a generation is about 25 years long?
It's usually between 20 and 30 now, but in the past it would have skewed younger. So I think 20 is a far more reasonable time frame. Note that this is actually more generous to creationists than the generation time Sanford is using. One generous group of people are my patrons and channel members. So if you're enjoying my content and you want to help keep it getting made, I encourage you to check out my Patreon and pledge there or join the channel. The Patreon starts at only $1 a month, and the membership's at only $1.99 a month. Patreon has a 15% discount if you pledge annually. Both give you early access to videos like this, as well as access to my super secret Discord server. Also, why not like the video since you've gotten this far in, and subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to turn on notifications in the hopes that YouTube will actually take seriously your desire to see my content.
We get a time frame for Eve. The time frame is 5,250 years ago.
Except it's not, though. It's more like 125,000 years ago, with me being absurdly generous to young Earthers, but refusing to just ignore drift and selection, and also refusing to cherry-pick the wrong amount of divergence from the coalescent ancestor. Oops. So I've now run this basic calculation twice, once while not being particularly nice to creationism, and once while being absurdly generous to creationism. And I got 31,125 in one instance, and 125,000 in the other. No matter which way you look at it, the only way to get the young Earth number is to lie about reality. Because I know Sanford knows that drift and selection are real, and I know that he knows that he needs to account for maximum divergence, not average divergence. Once again, if you think I'm wrong, that he's lying, please tell me why you think that he's a moron in the comments. I don't think he is a moron. I think he's a man smart enough to be a PhD researcher in genetics. You know, because that used to be his job.
Very close to 6,000 years is the time since Eve, and how many mutations have accumulated within people since Eve.
How about that? All you have to do to show that Eve existed is lie about what mitochondrial Eve is, lie about whether or not selection and drift are real, and then cherry pick your data anyway. It's hard to even imagine a way it could be more convincing that Sanford is a liar.
Is that stunning?
Yes, it is stunning, in that this amount of academic fraud is hard to believe.
It is, because genetically, mitochondrial DNA is saying there seems to be a recent ancestor in our genetics.
I guess it depends on if you think hundreds of thousands of years is recent or not. It's not according to young Earth creationism, but I guess it is compared to how long ago the Cambrian was.
And it's fitting more the biblical timeline than anything even close to an evolutionary or old Earth creation timeline.
Well, yeah, when you're willing to lie and cherry pick, you can get any answer you want. I want to be more clear about why it's the maximum divergence that he has to account for. Let's say that you had a group of pedestrians, all of whom started at the same building and then walked for a while. None of them are particularly tired, so it wasn't a brisk or fast walk. It was probably a leisurely walk of about 3 miles an hour or less. Now, most of them walked about 2 to 3 miles, and you figure that they've been walking for less than an hour. But one of them has managed to get 18 miles. So either that person walked faster than most people can sprint, and did it for 18 miles, or your estimate for how long ago everybody set off from their starting point, based on the average distance walked, is way off. It is similar. If the average divergence is 21 mutations, but there are some mitochondrial lineages with more than 100 mutations, you need to account for them, too.
And so basically, this means that systems are breaking down.
No, it doesn't. This requires the assumption that all mutations observed compared to his consensus genome are deleterious. He has nowhere ever actually demonstrated that. He's just assuming the truth of genetic entropy to make this statement. But genetic entropy is unfathomably wrong and stupid, as has already been explained at length in both this series as well as elsewhere.
So the consensus sequence would be the perfect sequence.
He has done nothing to demonstrate that. He hasn't even proposed a way to measure so-called perfection in a genome. Also, I have to point out, talking about perfect genetics really sounds a whole lot like eugenics, and is probably a bad idea. We know where the idea of eugenics goes, and at best, it's the forced sterilization of black women in what was once the United States. And at worst, it's just the actual Holocaust.
First sequence, all the rest, we just keep getting more and more mutations.
Once again, I don't even know what he actually said there. The audio quality on his end is atrocious. It's like he doesn't even want to be understood. He needs to hire a tech guy to at least do some basic setup on his streaming rig.
So now let's take a look at evidence 2, which is Y chromosome Adam. Okay.
Well, first, I bet this will be directly parallel to the mitochondrial Eve discussion, so nothing even remotely compelling will be offered. And he'll probably once again depend on lying. Second, the reason he's focusing on the Y chromosome is that, like the mitochondria, it is inherited from one parent and does not undergo crossover with other chromosomes. This makes the math surrounding the coalescence of the Y chromosome easier than it is for the rest of DNA, just like with the mitochondrial genome.
So this is a bigger chromosome, but we're going to do the same type of analysis.
The only difference the size of the chromosome makes is how long your computer has to crunch numbers and how big the mutation and substitution rates are likely to be.
So you can Google Y chromosome Adam, and what does it say?
Okay, I Googled it in Chrome in an incognito tab. This is so Google doesn't use my search history to bias the results. It says, Y chromosomal Adam is the most recent common male ancestor of all living humans. He is the earliest male from whom all living humans can trace their lineage through an unbroken line of male ancestors. That's the AI overview, and despite the fact that AI just makes stuff up all the time, that seems a pretty reasonable answer to me.
It says that all Y chromosomes come from one man.
Yep, that's still required by math, and it's true for all other parts of the genome too, except that we can't determine the sex of the individual from whom all of us got that section of our genome. And it still in no way implies that that man was the only man who existed, or even the only man from the time with living descendants. Just that he's the guy that you get to if you trace Y chromosomes from son to father to grandfather to great-grandfather, and so on, as the first guy all lines lead to. But there is literally no reason to think he was the only male alive at the time, or that he did not himself have a father whose Y chromosome he inherited. And also, at least according to the Bible, he'd be Noah or one of his descendants, not Adam. Unless, of course, Mrs. Noah was stepping out and not telling her husband. But hey, I'll leave that idea to the people writing Genesis cuck fanfiction. You do you crazy kids.
What's the chances of that?
According to evolution, like 100%.
Even if even if Eve was filled with a world of similar women,
which mitochondrial Eve was,
and they all died, and she just happened to stay there.
What the actual No, they all lived perfectly ordinary lives, mitochondrial Eve too. No one at the time would have noticed any particular difference between her and all the other females around having babies, many of whom were themselves female. I have no idea what kind of weird strawman fantasy Sanford is imagining as the mainstream view of how the coalescent ancestors for given parts of the genome work.
How then would there be one man?
The same way. Over that time, that lineage became overrepresented, as other lineages died out, and eventually it was the only one left of all the lineages that existed at the time the individual who is now Y chromosome Adam lived. And if you went back in time, there would have been an even older Y chromosome Adam, and since then more lineages of Y chromosome diversity have died out. Like, as an example, different lineages of the Y chromosome are called haplogroups. The most divergent haplogroup is A, which means that Y chromosome Adam is the most recent male line ancestor of A and all other haplogroups. But if the A lineage went extinct, which would not require all the people in Y chromosome haplogroup A to die or fail to reproduce, just to have fewer male offspring on average than other lineages over time, then the identity of the Y chromosomal Adam would shift to the common ancestor of haplogroups B and the rest. That will shift the time to Y chromosome Adam up like 50,000 years, and obviously to a new individual. That doesn't mean that the earlier Y chromosome Adam didn't exist, or that the new one was the only male around. We know he couldn't have been, because earlier there were people from other haplogroups that were not descended from him in terms of their Y chromosome.
It's coming from God.
What, basic math and population genetics? I mean, if you want to think those are from God, I won't stop you, but they certainly aren't helping the case for a historical Adam as seen in Genesis, or a historical Noah for that matter. But then perhaps there is something to the idea that God is telling us through basic math and population genetics to stop treating Genesis 1 through 11 as a history book.
I mean, God is showing us the things that most people don't want to see.
So I just did a Google Scholar search for Y chromosome Adam since the year 2024, the most recent past year as the time of my writing this. I also made sure that Adam was in quotes so that only papers that actually have that word come through. There were 7,120 results. I wouldn't count that as no one looking into the Y chromosome data. That seems like a whole lot of people were doing it. Let me know in the comments if you think Sanford made this up and has no clue how many people are working on data regarding the Y chromosome Adam, or if he does know and is just lying. In this case, I think it could go either way. Although, if he just doesn't know, it does mean that he is not keeping up with the relevant literature, but speaking on it as if he has some authority, which would require him to keep up. So I guess to some extent, both options end up with Sanford being a liar, just in different ways.
Because they don't want God.
Nothing about the existence of the mathematically required coalescent point for the Y chromosome in any way answers a question about whether God exists. At least not more than any other random logically necessary fact.
We now have an approximation of the Y chromosome sequence and its consensus.
So, okay, a direct parallel to everything we just went over with mitochondrial Eve, which means that this will be stupid for the same reasons. But also, I'm a little surprised that he hasn't pointed out that it should be Noah who's the Y chromosome Adam. Maybe he thinks that pointing out that the identity of Y chromosome Adam can shift will undermine his argument. If we take history as presented by young Earthers seriously, then until the flood, Noah was not Y chromosomal Adam. But then he was afterwards. This shows that there is no reason that Y chromosome Adam has to be the first man, or the only man, or even the only man with living descendants. For example, Noah's wife had a father who presumably was not Noah. The same is true for his sons' wives. This means that even if Noah is Y chromosome Adam, other men who were alive when he was have living descendants. It's just that to get to them, you have to go through a female line, like Noah's wife or daughters-in-law. If Y chromosome Adam doesn't have to be the first guy ever, then I guess it follows that mitochondrial Eve doesn't have to be the first gal ever. And the whole argument falls apart. Which, it does. At this point, the only interesting thing Sanford could do would be to mention Noah and talk about the implications. Let's see if he does that, shall we?
Spoiler! He does not.
And what we see is very little variation, which means it's young, like you say.
Sure, but just like when we run the numbers with mitochondrial variation, when we do it with the Y chromosome and also don't pretend that selection and drift are fake or that we don't need to take into account the maximum variance, we still get an answer a couple of orders of magnitude too big for young Earthers.
So Adam was recent, and so it's spread out more because it's a bigger chromosome. Each ring now is 200 mutations.
So at maximum, we seem to have about 700 mutations to account for. Cool.
The diagram is just like Eve, it's just that it's more diverse.
Yep.
Because it's a bigger chromosome.
Yep, we've already been over this. Sanford might be the worst public speaker among all the creationists I've ever encountered. And I've talked to some pretty bad ones.
And so, but basically the original sequence is in the middle, the red spot. That person is long gone, but the blue people are the descendants, and they are all diverging away from the first one.
Yep, that sure is how mutations from a reconstructed consensus genome at the time of coalescence works.
And so it's like stunning.
The only thing that's stunning is the mountain that Sanford is making out of a molehill of predicted data.
So how long ago did Adam live?
Okay, let's do this. We need to account for about 700 mutations, and the rate of mutation, according to Sanford, is about 1 per generation. But that's after ignoring selection and drift, making the real number more like 0.1 per generation. We get about 7,000 generations. Now, multiply that by our generous 20-year generation time, and we get 140,000 years ago. Neat! That's within what he claims as the conventional range of 57,000 to 340,000. Wow, it's almost like there's a good reason for those estimates.
People have claimed, evolutionists have claimed, that it's between 57,000 years and 340,000 years.
a claim Sanford's own data back up, as long as you don't forget that we live in the real world and also cherry pick.
That's a big gap.
No, it's a big range, and also it seems suspiciously big. And I keep seeing estimates from 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, which is a much smaller gap. So I think he's just cherry-picking early estimates, but I honestly don't care to check.
And also a long time frame. But when we did our research, the average accumulation was about 300 mutations per Y chromosome.
Which again is meaningless. You have to account for the maximum divergence, not the average.
And if we assume, if we know the rate, it's about 1 mutation per generation.
Once again, this depends on pretending that selection and drift are not real. An assumption that I have trouble imagining Sanford doesn't understand is nonsense.
So to get 300 mutations would be equivalent to getting about 300 generations.
Fun fact, the island of Tristan da Cunha was settled in about 1810 or so. That's more than 8 generations ago, according to the 25-year generation time Sanford likes. Their Y chromosomes have been sequenced, and they don't have 8 or 9 mutations that have accumulated. They have about 0, and a few people have a bit more. And we know they haven't been having immigration to the island that introduced new Y chromosomes. The Y chromosomes that are there are descended from those of the first British colonists, and there literally is no native population from before them, as the island was discovered completely uninhabited by humans. So real-world data says that Sanford is full of shit.
So if we multiply by 25, because that's the generational time, what we find is that the original Y chromosome was about 7,500 years ago.
Yet again, when you ignore reality and cherry-pick, you can come up with numbers that match your predetermined conclusion that you came to because you think it's keeping your marriage together.
Wow. About 6,000. Wow. Now, these are rough numbers. All of these are approximate.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly.
And if you do bigger studies, you might get more. But you'll find that to be anywhere near 6,000 speaks loud and clear of a recent and solitary Adam and Eve.
Nope, even if his math was right, Adam should be Noah. So why is he getting an age that's like 50% older than Noah should be? And just the fact that it should be Noah shows that even if his numbers were right, it doesn't mean either Y chromosome Adam or mitochondrial Eve are necessarily solitary or isolated. And there's no reason to think they ever met or reproduced with each other. In fact, since according to the young Earth conception of history, Y chromosome Adam is really Noah, we can be pretty well assured that Y chromosome Adam did not reproduce with their mitochondrial Eve. This whole argument falls apart even on its own basis. It's not even internally consistent. So it sure as hell can't be used as evidence of a historical Adam and Eve as described in the Bible. The only thing that it can actually give evidence of is that John Sanford is a fraud and a liar.
So when William Lane Craig, who's put it here, John Pinky's throwing this in here, he says William Lane Craig is saying somewhere around 750,000 years ago. He's off by an order of 10. I mean, it's...
First, I don't know if William Lane Craig has said anything of that kind. That's more than twice as long ago as any estimate I've seen, but also 750,000 divided by 7,500 is 100, not 10. But then again, given that creationists are routinely off by 7 or so orders of magnitude, I guess I'll let that one go.
That's way off from what the genetics is showing us today.
I mean, it is, but by a factor of about 2.5, whereas Eric and Sanford need to be off by a factor of 50 or so. So, you know, they're off by a heck of a lot more.
And what, he's a philosopher, what knowledge is he basing this on?
I have no idea, but that's probably a question for Craig, not Hovind.
You know, one of the things that I say over and over again is the issue is, who is your authority?
When it comes to science, there is no answer to who my authority is, because there is none. If I actually care to learn the truth of a matter, my authority is the empirical evidence. If I don't care, then I either remain agnostic or I accept the consensus of those whose authority is the evidence and who have dedicated their lives to figuring out what that evidence says.
You can honor God or you can honor man.
Which one is honored by lying about genetics? Because I feel like it's neither.
Who do you turn to for what you trust in?
When it comes to science, I turn to the empirical evidence.
And what the world wants mostly is to put their trust in the latest, movie star or president or whatever.
I mean, maybe on some topics, but I don't remember any presidents or movie stars talking about the dating of mitochondrial Eve or Y chromosome Adam. So I feel like that might not be relevant here.
But Christians, we should not be thinking that way. We should be thinking, well, if I had to choose between a fancy-dancy professor who's famous and Jesus Christ, I don't think it's going to be a very hard decision.
The decision is between an interpretation of a book that is at odds with reality and accepting reality as it is. I don't think that should be a hard decision, but I guess I'm wrong.
And so it has to do, again, with the issue of belief versus unbelief.
Actually, here I'll agree. It's between those Christians and not who believe the evidence and those who do not, like our two chuckle here.
And those who do not believe are offending the Lord in the most possible, in the most horrific way.
You know, I hope that's true. God should be offended in the most horrific way by Sanford's refusal to believe the evidence all around him, and his insistence in spreading false teachings.
And so why do Christians question what is so clearly presented in Scripture?
Two main reasons: they don't share Sanford's interpretive framework, and because they care about actual evidence. I guess technically the second one isn't universal.
It's kind of mind-boggling. So
I did have a factor of 100, Andrew. Thank you. Off William Lane Craig off by a factor of 100.
Hey, someone on Hovind's staff can do arithmetic.
Dr. Sanford, I got to let social media go, but I want to answer a couple questions from them real quick. The idea that Charlemagne goes back to Christ, since Christ had no offspring, is that going back to Mary or Joseph, who did continue to have children? Is that kind of how they go back to, quote, Christ is going to actually, the brother of Jesus?
An actually intelligent question.
The brother of Jesus is what the genealogies of Charlemagne and other kings of Europe, they speak of, I think it was James.
James, okay.
James,
the brother of Jesus, yeah.
Oh, he thinks that. That seems like the kind of thing you'd want to look up first.
But the lineage was through, we don't know the genome of Jesus, but
right.
But Joseph and Mary, I think, we don't have their sequence, but we know that their generations, their genealogies are very, very well preserved.
That is amazing.
It would be if we had anything to go on other than propaganda for whatever local tyrant was in charge. After Hovind reads Philippians 1:11, I don't really care, then it's just a commercial for the extended paid version of this video. I'm not giving Hovind my money, so I'm not going to play any more of this nonsense. Well, I guess the whole of this hour-long interview that I've now turned into a 3-hour-long response series was just one barely valid argument, that of the coalescence time to mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam, but those failed on their own terms to be sound. I can't help but feel like Hovind and Sanford were just wasting my time. Oh well, if you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Hovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.